Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar today as we launch the new National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, or the NICCC. We are so excited that you could join us today, and we are thrilled to get this great resource out to the field. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them at the end of the webinar, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you do encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues we may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording the content portion of the webinar, and we will post it to the website at NICCC.csgjusticecenter.org. And I'll repeat that web address a little later in the presentation. And we should have the webinar posted online in the coming weeks. My name is Chidi Umez, and I am the project manager for the Criminal Records Project at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I'm joined today by Jessa Wilcox, Policy Advisor for Justice Systems with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the U.S. Department of Justice, and by Josh Gaines, Senior Policy Analyst for Criminal Records at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we get going, I'd like to invite Jessa to say a few words on behalf of BJA.
Thanks, Chidi. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. So I just want to welcome and thank everyone for joining today's webinar. The Department of Justice, through its administration and support of Second Chance Act programs, has demonstrated its commitment to encouraging the successful reentry of offenders and to reducing recidivism across the country. As President Trump, in proclaiming April's Second Chance Month, declared, affording those who have been held accountable for their crimes an opportunity to become contributing members of society is a critical element of criminal justice that can reduce our crime rates and prison populations, decrease burdens to the American taxpayer, and make America safer. In addition to directly supporting state, local, and tribal governments and reentry service providers through Second Chance Act grants, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA, is advancing the administration's reentry priorities with its ongoing investment in the National Reentry Resource Center, which promotes best practices in the field and provides information and guidance aimed at strengthening reentry efforts across the country. We think that understanding the collateral consequences of conviction is critical to strengthening those efforts. By collateral consequences, we mean the legal and regulatory restrictions that limit or prohibit people convicted of crimes from accessing employment, business and occupational licensing, housing, voting, education, and other opportunities. That is why BJA is proud to support the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, the NICCC, and excited to announce the launch of the new and improved version of this one-of-a-kind resource. The new NICCC makes it easier for reentry service providers, state, local, and tribal policymakers, offenders, and researchers to identify and understand the operation and effect of collateral consequences imposed by the federal system and the laws of all 50 states. By providing ready access to this knowledge, the NICCC will provide benefits to reentry stakeholders, including supporting the identification and navigation of career pathways available to offenders, making it easier for policymakers to evaluate the effects of these complex laws at both the state and national level, and dispelling myths and promoting facts about the barriers facing people with criminal conviction histories. I want to thank the Council of State Governments Justice Center for their great partnership and amazing work to overhaul and update the NICCC. We're really excited to see this tool put to work in the service of reentry efforts across the country. and we look forward to promoting an understanding of the significance of this national resource and the critical information it contains. So thank you again for joining us, and TD, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jessa, and we want to continue to thank BJA for their support in this project. So today we'll get started with an introduction to collateral consequences generally and the effects on reentry outcomes. Then I'm going to give some background on the development of the NICCC before we get into the features of the new NICCC. So collateral consequences generally. So what are collateral consequences? As Jessa said earlier, these are legal restrictions that limit or prohibit people convicted of crimes from accessing employment, housing, and other rights, benefits, and opportunities. A lot of these regulations and policies are scattered throughout the state and federal statutory regulatory codes and are frequently unknown to those, even to those responsible for their administration or enforcement. Collateral consequences have an impact on the individual and their families. In March 2014, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Forward Together, and Research Action Design launched a collaborative research project with 20 community-based organizations across the country to address the impact of collateral consequences. Specifically, the survey examined the impact of incarceration on individuals as they reacclimate to society and the effect on loved ones who support these individuals. The survey found that 1 in 4 survey participants were denied or barred from educational loans because of their conviction. It also found that 79% of the participants were ineligible or denied housing due to their own or a loved one's conviction. From our research here at the Justice Center, we found that there are nearly 14,000 collateral consequences that limit occupational licensing opportunities for individuals with criminal records. We also know that the majority of the consequences affect employment. Employment is a major area that's affected, and nearly half of the consequences in the database are related to employment. While nearly every industry is affected in some form, from food service to nuclear science, those that are already subject to a significant amount of state regulation tend to be most impacted. That includes the healthcare industry, child and elder care, education, banking, finance, commercial and passenger transportation. This is significant because we know that employment is an important factor in a person's successful reentry, as it creates stronger positive relationships, creates income for families, promotes pro-social activities, which all help to reduce a person's likelihood to reoffend. Collateral consequences also affect other rights, benefits, and opportunities, as I said earlier, including housing, public benefits, educational opportunities, eligibility for government contracts, firearms ownership, and many more. These policies can be broad and do vary in many ways. Some may note whether it is a mandatory imposition, which means the decision maker, which could be a licensing board, a regulatory agency, housing providers, have essentially no or limited discretion in the imposition of the consequence. Some have specific time limits or have no specific language as to how long they are imposed on the person, and many include specific crimes or have broad categories of crimes that would trigger the consequence. And for policymakers thinking about these statutes, there are a few considerations that go into this process, including balancing public safety concerns, making sure there's a level of transparency and consistency, and yet trying to avoid over-inclusion. So with the complexity of these collateral consequences and their impact on so many individuals with criminal convictions, the need to compile these policies in a central location created the development of the NICCC. And so in 2007, Congress issued a directive in the Court Security Improvement Act for the cataloging of collateral consequences imposed by state and federal law, their attributes in a searchable online database. This catalog, which became the NICCC, was originally created by the American Bar Association and the National Institute for Justice with support from BJA. In 2017, the CSG Justice Center began the incredible process of updating the inventory, refining the functionalities, and creating a site that's streamlined for various users, including defense attorneys, people with criminal convictions, prosecutors, reentry service providers, and researchers. And so with that, let's get into the database, and I'll hand it over to Josh Gaines to walk us through.
Right. All right, so what you are looking at here is the new NICCC, or NICCC, I should say, which is launching today. It is available now at NICCC.csgjusticecenter.org. And what I want to do now is just take some time to sort of show you how this database is organized, show you how you can use it to identify consequences, whether you're working in the reentry services field, an attorney, policymakers, policy analysts, all of these things. We're going to kind of dive in and take a look at some hypotheticals and put it through its paces. First, though, I want to say a little bit about how the data is organized and what's actually contained in the resource here. So, as Judy mentioned, the NICCC catalogs the collateral consequences imposed by the statutes and regulations of all 50 states, the federal system, and the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And the way it's fundamentally organized is that each consequence is identified, it's given a brief description, and then it's categorized by a number of features that describe the nature and operation of the consequence. And this categorization helps users search and filter the consequences and allows them to easily identify relevant consequences based on common characteristics. So what you're looking at here is the start page, and it's for most users where the searching will begin. We also have kind of a more advanced search page, and I'm going to go there now, and we'll come back to this initial search page in a moment. Just because I want to walk you through all of these different features that we use to categorize consequences. So first we have keywords. And keywords identify consequences based on the specific rights, benefits, opportunities, and fields of employment and licensure that the consequences affect. If I were to click on this here, you can see a list of all of the keywords that we use on the site. And examples of those include accounting, adoption, adult care and nursing homes, agriculture, jury service, and law enforcement, corrections, and public safety. Now, we also have the consequence type field. And what this does is identify consequences based on the broad rights, benefits, and opportunities that they affect. And examples of these include employment and volunteering, business licensure and participation, housing and residency, and government benefits. And conceptually, there's obviously a bit of overlap between this idea of the keywords and the consequence type. They both sort of describe what the consequence affects. But by making the consequence types very broad and the keywords very narrow in scope, you can actually use them in conjunction to find consequences with a good deal of precision. So, for example, if you wanted to find out about accounting business licensure consequences, using the two together, you could choose the accounting keyword along with the business consequence type and really sort of hone in on what it is you're looking for. Jurisdiction, self-explanatory. So we have 54 jurisdictions, all of the states, federal, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And you can select one or more of those here. The offense type, this identifies the categories of crimes that may trigger a consequence. And examples of these include controlled substances offenses, crime involving fraud, theft, and property, and crimes of violence, including person offenses. Now, one thing that I do want to note about this category is that offense types identify the categories that specific offenses fall within. So, for example, controlled substances offenses as a category doesn't necessarily mean that a consequence is going to be triggered by all controlled substances offenses, just one or more specific offenses that involve controlled substances. Down here we have discretion, and this is something that Chidi also touched on earlier, whether a consequence has to be imposed or whether a decision maker may choose whether or not to impose a consequence. Here we have 5 different ways that we sort of look at discretion and assign discretion to a consequence. We have mandatory and automatic, so that's, the consequence must be imposed. Discretionary, where decision makers have the ability to, choose to forego imposing a consequence. Background check, which is kind of a little bit tangential to discretion, but we wanted to capture it here. And what that does is there are plenty of provisions of law that authorize or require a decision maker to obtain somebody's criminal history before offering employment or any other right, benefit, or opportunity, but don't specify what to do with the information contained in that background check. And so really discretion isn't applicable there, but we wanted to make sure that we were capturing these as well. So we have that background check category there. We also have a discretionary waiver category, and this captures consequences that are mandatory unless a person seeks and obtains a waiver from the imposition of that mandatory consequence. We also have this category varies here, and varies is used anytime the level of discretion to impose a consequence is going to depend usually upon the offense type involved. So, for example, if a licensing revocation is mandatory for any felony, and discretionary for a variety of misdemeanors, we would say that the discretion varies for that consequence. And then duration is our kind of final feature, and this indicates primarily whether a consequence is time limited or whether it applies indefinitely. So here we have time limited. There, is a definite time in which the consequence will expire. Indefinite, it's permanent or it's not stated in the law when it will expire. Conditional, which is when the length of time that a consequence lasts is dependent on some other action. A good example of this is driver's license suspensions that last until a person completes a driver improvement program, for example. A lot of consequences involving controlled substances, convictions may do something similar, where the consequence lasts until a person completes some sort of treatment. And then again, we have that varies category, which is essentially the same as in the discretion. Anytime the duration depends on the type of offense. So that is kind of an overview of the general structure, sort of how we look at each consequence and describe it. And putting all of those things together, you can use the database to get some really interesting results and really targeted results. There are over 40,000 entries in this database right now, but as we'll see in just a moment, you can really wade through those efficiently using these. So let's just run through some examples of use cases, and I've got some hypotheticals that we'll go through here and just see how the NICCC works. So as I said before, this is an advanced search page, and this is what we're looking at here, and this gives you, all the search options. But let's go back to where we started on the home page here. And the home page has a limited number of search options so that it's not, overwhelming to users who may not be familiar with some of the terminology used in that more advanced search page. So here we've got keywords, and we've got consequence type and jurisdiction. And for most purposes, this is really going to be all you're going to need if you're sort of looking at a scenario where a person has, conviction X and they want to do Y. This is where you would sort of start. The hypothetical we're going to work with here is, let's say that we have a barber in Kansas, right? Has a drug possession conviction, is facing charges for that, is looking at accepting a plea deal for those charges, and wants to know whether, if they plead to that particular charge, they're going to have some problem with their barber's license. So we can do that really easily. The first thing we would do is look at our keyword, right? Now we're interested in barbering, so we could look through this whole list until we see barbering. And that would take a while. So what we can do instead is filter these keywords using this little box. And anytime you see a long list in a field here, you can do this same method to sort of whittle things down. So if we type in barber, there you go. Before we even finish typing it, we see cosmetology, barbering, electrology, tattooing, and body art. So we'll click that, and now we've got our keyword selected. We're in Kansas, so we can select our jurisdiction. We'll choose Kansas. And again, you could filter this list if you wanted to, or you can just click Kansas there. And consequence type, let's leave that blank for now because, we've already, kind of identified the barbering keyword. So let's just see what's there, and then if we need to sort of whittle it down further using consequence type, we can do that. We'll click the search consequences, and here we go. We have 3 matching entries in Kansas. And what this list is showing you is every provision of law in Kansas that applies to cosmetology, barbering, electrology, tattooing, and body art. And our first entry right here says deny, suspend, or revoke barber license. So right away we know that this is something we should be considering if we're looking at pleading to a charge and we are interested in working as a barber. Now, one thing I want to note about this this list, this is what you'll see anytime you get anytime you run a search. This is where your results will show up, and it'll show you various of the features and fields that apply to each consequence. And then each consequence, you see the citation and a brief description of it. So clicking on the description of any consequence will take you to what we call the consequence details page, and we'll do that now. And this is where you get even more information. So here you have all of those fields that we talked about before: discretion, keywords, duration, offense types, and you have some additional information. One thing that's really cool is that the citation here is clickable, and if you click on it, you're immediately taken to the full text of the law at issue, right? So here we're looking at the Kansas statute that affects barbering licenses. It's from the Kansas legislature's page, and it's a bit to look at. So if you want to you just kind of hone in on the relevant language here, we make that pretty easy to do using this relevant subsections item here. So this says A12. We'll go and look at our, go back to our law here. So A, the board may censure, limit, condition, suspend, revoke, or refuse to issue, reinstate, or renew a license of any applicant or licensee upon proof that the applicant or licensee, down here to 12, has been convicted of any felony or misdemeanor offense of a crime against persons or involving illegal drugs as determined by the board in rules and regulations, etc. So, so you can, immediately get, see the text of the law, view it in context, get into all of the nuance that may be there, and then on this consequence details screen kind of get a summary of the operation of it. And some other things that we include here that you won't see elsewhere on the site, information specific to these consequence details pages, are notes and other information. And this is anytime we have sort of, broad things that affect, a wide variety of consequences within a particular jurisdiction, we'll note it here. So here we have C, Kansas statute annotated 74-120 for general limitations on the use of convictions as the basis for denial of occupational or professional licensure. So Kansas has a general law that limits the ability of licensing boards to discriminate based on criminal conviction. And obviously, and we note that here, because you would want to take that into account when you are, assessing how a criminal conviction is going to impact a barber's license. All right, so we know that this controlled substance conviction is going to potentially be a problem, right, for this barber. So let's say now we want to kind of look at other employment opportunities and how they might be affected by a controlled substances conviction like this. And it's pretty easy to do using this new site. You don't have to start over. We can sort of just seamlessly sort of explore and move between kind of different areas of the law. And to do that, we would just click back to search results up here. And we're back to our results, right? And all of these headers up here are also actually filters, right? And so you can add and remove things from these headers to sort of expand and narrow your searches, right? So we want to look at employment generally, right? And not limit ourselves to cosmetology. So for our keyword, what we can do is we'll click it right there, and then we'll just get rid of that by clicking that X right there, right? So now we're not limited to a particular field, okay? And we want to look at all employment, right? So this is where our consequence type would come in. Our type, we go down and select employment. So now we are looking at every employment consequence in the state of Kansas that is imposed by Kansas law. And now we want to look at those consequences which are, those employment consequences which are triggered by one or more controlled substance offenses. You can see, and I should probably back up here a bit, but you can see we don't have that offense type up here on our heading. But you can add any of those variables to this results list very easily by clicking this Show More Options option here. And if we click offense type, you can see it adds it right there. And so now we can view the offense types that apply to each of the listed consequences, but you can also limit, right, the list based on a particular offense type. So here we'll click controlled substance offenses. And so now, we've gone from this very specific thing, and we've sort of broadened it out for this person with this controlled substance conviction. And we can see that there are 63 matching entries in Kansas. These are all employment and volunteering related collateral consequences, and each of them is triggered, or may be triggered, I should say, by one or more controlled substance offenses. So let's go through another hypothetical here that I think will point out some other interesting features and useful information. First of all, to start over with a new search, we can do one of two things. We can, click the logo up here, like with most websites, go back to the home page, and then, get that initial search screen again. Or we can click this Reset Search option here. And what that's going to do when we click it is take away all of our filters, right? So now we're looking at all 40,000 entries in the database. And if you had the time, and I, as much time as I've spent with this, have not yet found the time to sit down in one sitting and look at all 40,000 of these, you can do it this way. But I recommend filtering things up here if you can. So we have that, and then, to start a search, and like I said, we could, type in our filters here. But let's just go back, and we'll kind of start clean from the home page again to do this other search we're going to do. So for this hypothetical, let's say that a person in Maryland has a lead on an entry-level job working for a relative who runs a small chain of check cashing storefronts in Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. But this person has a felony assault conviction, right? And what we want to know is that conviction going to pose a barrier, or potential barrier, to employment? And so again, the best way to proceed usually is by using these keywords. And right now we're looking at, caching. So if we wanted, we could, obviously look through the list and see what's relevant, or we can filter it, right? So we can type in, let's see, check. All right, money services and check cashing. So if we click that, there's our keyword. Now for our jurisdiction, we're in Maryland. So we're going to scroll down and choose Maryland. All right. And we'll go ahead and click our search button. All right. And let's say that, in addition to Maryland, this person's relative has some stores, part of a chain that are maybe in, Virginia and D.C. as well. If we wanted to, add or remove things using this, we could easily do that. And you can select multiple values for each one of these fields. So we're looking at Maryland. Let's say we want to add Virginia. We can do that very easily. And if we wanted to add the District of Columbia, we can do that as well. For this, and I'll just start typing district, and there you go. So now we see that there are 19 matching entries, right? Each of these is related to money services and check cashing in these three jurisdictions that we've identified. Now, we've got 2 pages worth of results that you can see, right? So we're on page 1, and if we wanted to look at the other page, we'd click 2 and go over there. And we could, go through these, and it wouldn't take very long to see, what's relevant. But I want to show you how you can, use text searches to sort of even further refine your results list. So on the screen, you have this search within results box, and it works pretty much like you'd expect. You type in text, and it searches within the fields below it, right? So it'll search within the citation if you want to identify a particular citation, or it searches, it searches within the consequence description, right? We're interested in check cashing, so let's type in check. And let's hit search here. And now we've limited ourselves to 7 entries. Revoked check casher license, that's in D.C. Denied check cashing services license, that's in Maryland. Let's take a look at one of these here. I'll select this third one down here because I think it illustrates some interesting points. So again, we're looking at the consequence details page, and you can see this consequence details page has additional information that wasn't on the previous one we saw. That is the related laws portion right here. So you can see that it says background check, Maryland Financial Institutions Code, section 12-107. Anytime there is, another law that we've identified that informs the operation of a consequence or may inform the operation of a consequence, we note it in this related laws field. And if if there's information in that field, then obviously you'll see this header and field on the consequence details page. For the other, our Kansas barber, we didn't have any related laws there, so you didn't see that. One thing I want to point out too before we get too much further is just that each one of these question marks here, this will come as no surprise to most of you, it gives you more information about what you're looking at. So if you want to know what these fields do, you can see it there. And if you want to look, at more detailed help, you can click the additional information link, and we'll get to that soon. Now let's get back to our person working in check cashing in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. What I want to point out about this is we're looking for employment consequences, right? This person wants a job. They don't want to open a check cashing business. And if you look at the title of this, you can see that it says suspend, revoke check cashing service license. That's a business license, right? If you go into the check cashing business, you have to get a license. And we see that indicated right here under consequence type, right? Business licensure and participation. But let's take a look, and again, by clicking our citation here, we can look at the law itself. And here we see, subject to the hearing provisions of Section 12-123, the Commissioner may suspend or revoke the license of any licensee. Great, we're in that business licensing realm. If the licensee or the owner, director, officer, member, partner, stockholder, employee, or agent of the licensee is convicted of a felony or of a misdemeanor directly related to the fitness and qualification of the person to provide check cashing services. So the consequence, the law itself says, person with this license, your license can be impaired if you have one of these convictions. But it also says that, it's not just your convictions, right? Even your employees' convictions can impair the license. And what that is, for all practical purposes, is a collateral consequence that affects employment. Because if you have one of those convictions, there is, virtually no way that a person who runs one of these businesses is going to hire you. And we capture that in our coding and in the database. So here, for example, we note also that this is an employment and volunteering consequence in addition to a business licensure and participation consequence. So, conceptually, it's a bit of a mess and it's kind of confusing, like we said, but for the purposes of somebody searching this, just know that if you're looking for employment, you put in employment, you're going to see them whether it's employment in a strict legal sense or employment in a practical sense, whether it's employment in effect. So yeah, let's take a look at one more example. And then, which I think will illustrate a few more additional points. And then we'll take a look at some of the other resources available here on the site and hopefully have some time for some questions. So again, here we are. We've done a search. We want to start over again. We can hit back to search results, right? And for this one, let's just click our reset search here. And let's get rid of everything. All right, so now we've got a clean slate, and we're going to start whittling this list of 40,000 down. All right, and for this one, before we were sort of looking at examples where a person has works in a particular field, they have a particular conviction, and we want to get very specific using that information. You can also use this to get some to do some broad stuff, which is very useful for policy. For research, for service providers, that sort of thing. So let's get a look at how that would work. So for this hypothetical, let's say that there's a reentry service provider in Illinois. They want to be able to provide clients that are coming in with an overview of collateral consequences that might affect housing, right, in the area. And again, you start off with your jurisdiction, and I should note you don't have to select any of these, right? Any one of these search options that you leave blank is just not going to filter. So if we didn't choose a jurisdiction, right, we'd be looking at everything. But for now, let's stay inside of Illinois. All right. So now we're looking at all of the consequences in Illinois, and now for our consequence type, we're going to select housing. Here you see housing and residency. And now we see that there are 30 matching entries in Illinois that affect housing. One thing I want to note is that, we're in Illinois and we're looking at Illinois consequences, but there's a whole other universe of collateral consequences that are imposed at the federal level that are going to be applicable regardless which state you're in. And one of the areas that is, heavily federally regulated is housing. So we would want to be sure to include federal consequences when we look at, when we run this query. And we make that really easy to do just by clicking the Include Federal Consequences button right here. So now we click it and we've expanded now to 49 entries. You could do the same thing, you could choose federal from the jurisdiction list here. It does the same thing, but this is, I like having this here because it's kind of a helpful reminder that, hey, you need to keep this federal stuff in mind and lets you easily add it there. So let's take a look, let's do something else first. So we've got these 30 entries, right? We're an Illinois service provider. We want to have this information on hand, right? This is great that we can search it, and sort of go through it and figure it out. But what we really need is to, whenever somebody comes in, help them out by providing them with this information. We made this easy to do in a few ways. One thing that's neat is that all of the links, all of the URLs on the site are permanent. So I'm looking at this page. We just generated it using all of these filters and everything. If I were to copy this link right here and send it to a colleague, they opened it up, they would get the exact same information on their page, which is really neat. Another thing you can do is if you want to take this information offline to look at later, to analyze, to create, resources, fact sheets, that sort of thing for your reentry program here, you can do that by clicking the Export Results list here. And when you click that, what happens is a spreadsheet downloads and show you right here. The cool thing about the spreadsheet is that you're not just getting the information that's on that results list there. You are getting all of the data for every single entry in that results list, right? So you see, citation, URLs, mandatory, discretionary, additional defense details, all of that right there, which is very handy for sharing and for analysis. Now let's pull up just one example on this list real quick. Here, this is a consequence imposed by 225 Illinois compiled statutes 10/3.3, ineligible to operate adoption-only home convictions of applicants/adult residents. Note that this is one of those indirect consequences we looked at, right, where the conviction of one of the residents is going to impair the person who's operating the business, or in this case, the adoption home. And we note that as both business and housing here. But what I want to use this entry to point out is this right here, which you'll see on every consequence details page, number of consequences. What this number indicates, for the most part, are how many different variations in duration or discretion there are depending on the type of offense that triggers the consequence. So to put that another way, before on the older NICCC, anytime you had a consequence where the duration varied based on the type of conviction, you would get an entry for each of those variations. What we did is kind of combine those entries into a single entry, and then to preserve consistency, with the numbering, we noted the number of consequences that were merged into those entries down here. And where this really becomes important and where it's really relevant is when you go back to your search results page, right? Here we're looking at, we see there are 30 entries here, and we see out of 1,423 total consequences. Now this figure right here, this 1,423, is actually calculated using the number of consequences, right? So it's going to be a little bit greater than the actual number of entries. And if we were to clear out everything, right, so we're seeing everything, we see 44,631 total consequences. And we did it like that because this number, 48,000, is kind of what's been used a lot and echoed. 48,000 collateral consequences in the country, and that came from the old inventory. We did all of this merging of the entries, and obviously that compressed some of the data, but we didn't want to, give the impression that what's happening is, some massive decrease in collateral consequences. It's really just that we've combined them in a way to make it hopefully more usable, to give a more holistic view of each consequence. So that's pretty much our searching and how all of that works, and how you can use the NICCC, and we look forward to hearing about how people are using it out in the field, and how we can improve it. Before we move on to questions, I want to show just the few other items that we have on the page here. We have a news and resources link up top, which includes news and features about reentry and collateral consequences. We also have a resource list that includes, links to books, reports and articles, webinars down here. This will, of course, be up there soon. State studies and other studies of collateral consequences. Many states have their own inventories. And you can find all of that down here. We also have a About page, which reminds you where you are and what you're looking at. And then we have a Help page. And this is, if 50% of what I just said, 75%, 2% flies past you, then you can go here and get this detailed information about what everything means, how it all works. And I would really encourage people who are going to be making, who are going to be using this consistently, and particularly for research purposes and that sort of thing, to take a look at this, because it kind of tells you what you're seeing, and I think helps you draw the right conclusions from it. So please do check that out. And all of the tooltips that you see on the site will link to this page as well to make it easy. If you have questions, you can use this page to send a question to us. Anything from the website, issues with the website itself, general feedback, questions about collateral consequences. And I'll turn it over to Chidi now.
All right, thank you, Josh, for walking us through that and some of those user scenarios so that we can see exactly some of the situations in which people may need to use the website and how you can navigate through. Again, we have the help, the tooltips, and the ability to contact us if you have any questions. And so we've gotten a few questions now, and I'll read off a few here that we've gotten. So the first one is it possible to search an entire state to see all the consequences? And the answer is yes. And so as Josh went through, you can select a jurisdiction, and it will show you all of the entries and the consequences in that state. The second question says, who maintains the validity of the information housed here? And I can probably say it is maintained, and the information is maintained and updated internally here at the Justice Center. So our criminal records team, our awesome team, maintains the information and compiles the information for the inventory. And then the related question is, how current is the information? So if you saw on the site, we had on the consequence details page, there was a note there that indicates how current the information is. We, as I said earlier, we received, the inventory was transferred to the Justice Center in 2017. So we spent 2017 up to now to update the database and to update the information, which did take the entire year to do, and also because we had to really revamp a lot of the functionality of the database. And so the information on how current the information is will be on the site, but right now the information that is currently there is up to the 2017 legislative session. After we launch today, then we will proceed to start updating for the 2018 legislative session, and that's how we will maintain the information on the site. The next question said, how was all the law and the data compiled into the NICCC inventory? What was the process? I don't know if Josh wants to take that. I think that's a larger question that you can contact us separately for that, but I don't know if Josh wants to give a brief overview.
I think it's a good question, and it's helpful to know the answer. What's identified here is identified using a search algorithm. And so, it's a string that looks in the text of all of these laws to indicate whether a collateral consequence might be present. I think it's just important to note that the results we're getting are good, and we have a high rate of success in identifying these things. But obviously, things that don't respond to our algorithm aren't going to come up, and we're taking additional steps to identify those and add them as we find them, so it can be as complete as it can be.
All right, that's a quick and dirty version of how we went through the process. The next question is really talking about the number of consequences feature and how that affects the number of consequences we showed on the page versus the number of entries. I think that's what the question is saying. And so just to go back to that, you'll see two separate numbers when you do a search. You'll see number of entries, and then it'll say out of total number of consequences. So if you are in Illinois and you did a search, keyword search for barbering, for example, you will see the number of entries that include the word barbering in the state. That's the first number, and then the second number, because when you go to the consequence detail page, there might be two consequences in one statute. And so the total number of consequences will take account the two consequences in the one entry for barbering. And again, that's because in the previous database, there were those were listed out, but we thought it would be more helpful for folks to see one statute and then note how many consequences may be written within that one statute. And again, it may get a little complex, so we really encourage folks to reach out to us to be able to answer those types of questions. All right, the next question, is there a possibility that in the future the database would include possible remedies or relief from negative consequences of conviction?
It is 100% possible as of now. So we have already all of that information in the database. If you look at the keywords, you'll see that we have keywords for expungement and sealing. We have a keyword that is limitation on imposition of collateral consequence, which would categorize any of those laws, like that Kansas licensing law that we noted when looking at the barber. Which says, essentially, that, you have to take X, Y, and Z into consideration when you're evaluating somebody with a criminal history before you can issue a denial. We have keywords for executive pardon, all of these things. So they're all there in the database and easily searchable. I should note also that the Clean Slate Clearinghouse is another a great resource for finding that information, and you can find links to that on the NICCC as well.
Great, thanks, Josh. The next question said, how would you suggest reentry centers use this with clients? And so Josh did go through a scenario where someone is working with a reentry service provider, particularly trying to figure out what what consequences affect their employment options and employment possibilities. And so we really, and that to us is the best way that reentry centers can use this. So the information there contains consequences that affect a person's housing options, employment, specifically their ability to access public benefits. And so using the keywords, reentry service providers can really type in the keywords that affect the clients, and if they know, if you know what their convictions are, you can type in the offense category, or you can look at the offense category and be able to walk through or to advise and counsel the client on what will be the effects of the conviction that they have and how they can move forward with their reentry process. Okay, the next question says, are there any plans to include local ordinances?
There are not currently, and that's a great question because it illustrates the limitations of the database. This is all state law, it's all federal law, but it's important for everyone to recognize that there are a lot of collateral consequences that are imposed at the municipal level, at the county level, that are not going to be captured here. As a general matter, things like professional licensure, business licensure, these sorts of broader things, government benefits, and all, are largely state and federal. But when you start getting into, very, very narrow types of employment, I know where I am, there's a limitation or a background check at least for people who want to drive a food truck, and food trucks are, regulated at the city level. So that's a great question and important to note.
Great. And then with the few minutes we have, we'll take the last two questions. So the first one of the two is, who did you target as your user demographic? So this one was tough. As you can imagine, this is a complicated area, especially when you're talking about these state laws and how they differ, and then there's a federal regulation. And so we really try to figure out try to go through different user test cases to figure out how to get the best out of this resource. And so, we tried to be everything to everyone, but it was, as you can imagine, it was definitely a hard task to be able to do that. And so with the keywords and the offense types, so in the search categories, we were thinking about folks who are impacted, folks with criminal records. You can at least be able to use those keywords and think about the industry that you're in, or to think about what you're looking for. So we really try to make those keywords as common as possible, given that they do vary across the different states. Obviously, for defense attorneys, and we have the information where you can link to the state statute and read the law in a totality, look at it in a broader context and not just in isolation. For reentry service providers as well, we did the keywords, the occupational types. Again, really trying to think about how folks can use this and how it can be as streamlined and as easy to use as possible. And then, again, prosecutors, so attorneys, attorneys in general, providing that statutory language, that link to the state site, so they can be able to read the law for those who are there, but adding the specific section of the law, again, for those who may not necessarily be as versed in reading statutory language. Again, we try to really think about as many people as possible, but understanding that there will just be some things that we could not be able to accommodate for as folks are using the site. And that's why we really encourage folks to reach out to us. If you have questions, reach out to legal service providers in your area for these questions, especially those that are specific to the state law and how consequences are administered there. And then the last question with the last minute here, are there any specific utilization, any specific utilization of the website for juvenile offenders?
So juvenile, adjudications, which are not, generally technically convictions, are captured in the database here insofar as they impose collateral consequences. So you can certainly identify collateral consequences affecting juveniles or people who had juvenile adjudications in their past who are adults now. I think, really looking at the keywords, you'll find that there are some that, very much impact juveniles more so than others, particularly when you're looking at education, that sort of thing. We have an entire keyword that's just students and interns, for example. So, I think overall the utilization is going to be the same as we just showed, but sort of, what you're searching for is really what you want to think about there.
All right, with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I also want to say thanks to Jessa and Josh for a great presentation. To learn more about webinars like this one and other resources, please subscribe to the National Reentry Resource Center newsletter or send questions to the contact information on your screen. And with that, I'll say thank you again and have a great afternoon.